Thomas Hertel, Distinguished Professor of Agricultural Economics, will come in by teleconference, and Nelson Villoria, who is here. Where's Nelson? Right here. His Research Assistant Professor in Agricultural Economics will both describe a 2-year pilot project to establish and maintain a freely available, spatially explicit database to track the impacts of environmental changes on agricultural resources on a global basis, something that's critically needed. This database will be accompanied with analytical tools and training programs for scientists, decision makers, and development practitioners. And they'll be talking about a globally spatially explicit open source database for analysis of agriculture, forestry, and the environment called GEOSHARE.
Okay, well, good morning. Sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'm enjoying a productive sabbatical at Stanford University this year, and much of my time has been devoted to this GeoShare project. I'd like to give you a little bit of background on it, context for how this came about. The idea for GeoShare actually originated in a meeting 2 years ago organized by the UK science advisor, Sir John Beddington, who commissioned a foresight study on the long-run sustainability of the global food system. So I was one of a number of presenters there presenting global modeling results on this topic. And after the first few presentations, it became clear to me that the global food sustainability community was in dire need of some common database infrastructure. And so as each modeling group made their presentation, they would typically start out saying, well, we spent 90% of our time developing the database to do this analysis. We're sorry we haven't been able to deal with irrigation in this study. I know it's very important for adaptation to climate change, but here are results we managed to run them last night. The next group came along and said, well, we spent so much time on the database, we spent all our time on irrigation, we weren't able to deal with many of the crops, and here are results we ran last night. So they were, each group was spending an enormous amount of time developing the spatially explicit data needed to say something meaningful about the long-run sustainability of the global food system. But they were doing this in a way that wasn't mutually beneficial, didn't build on one another, ended up generating inferior products for everyone involved and consuming almost all of their time. So there's clearly a big problem here, and it reminded me of the state of affairs in global trade analysis 20 years ago. That was when I initiated the Global Trade Analysis Project, GTAP, based at Purdue University, and there are now 10,000 members in that community, and we share a common global database, and it's used for trade policy analysis, it's used for climate policy analysis, and it's greatly enhanced the productivity of scientists, of policy advisors, and decision makers in this community. And it seemed to me that like a no-brainer that we should have something similar, something like GTAP for global sustainability. So I was fortunate to sit next to Sir John Beddington at dinner. He's a biologist, and he immediately understood the importance of common database infrastructure and the importance of investing in public goods. So basically, he asked Nelson and myself to develop a proposal to survey the state of affairs in this area, and we did that. It culminated in a 70-page report. It was reviewed by many, many people around the world, and concluded that, yes, there is great need for this spatial database infrastructure. We started to refine our thinking. And it was about that time that the Global Policy Research Institute put out a call for seed grant proposals. And so the timing was perfect. We thank GPRI for that. And we put in a proposal, and that gave rise to a workshop. The workshop has given rise to further development of GeoShare. So the Global Policy Research Institute's been really important in this process, and we want to thank them here, but we also want to tell you a little more about GeoShare and where it's going. So Nelson, if you could give the next slide. we'll just say, I'll briefly say something about the mission and the vision. Let me advance my own slide here for a minute. So when we started out, we were thinking primarily about a database. But as we've gotten into this whole process, as we've written proposals and thought more about this, our vision has broadened. And now we envision not just a global database, but analysis tools. We envision this all running on Purdue's HubZero IT infrastructure. We envision training programs, engagement of students on campus, young scientists and researchers, and we envision this connecting to decision makers and practitioners in developing countries. So our mission and vision have broadened considerably, and they're stated here as you can read them. Nelson, let's go to the next slide, if you would. So the next slide, and this is my last slide, and I'll turn it over to Nelson for the duration of the talk. Just make a few important points by way of motivation for this. We're all pretty well familiar with the population challenge that has been in the news this year, with reaching 7 billion people on the planet and expecting a couple billion more by mid-century. And so feeding these people a much richer diet in many cases for those below the poverty line currently. Doing this in the face of changing climate, still trying to preserve the environment, and eliminating extreme poverty, this is a big challenge. And we think GeoShare is well positioned to help contribute to analysis of this challenge and possible solutions. So agriculture is at the heart of the challenge, and agriculture is at the heart of GeoShare. There are three reasons for this. First of all, from a greenhouse gas point of view and a climate change point of view, farming and land use change combined account for about 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's a lot. Furthermore, we estimate in some of our modeling work that at modest carbon prices, these activities could contribute up to 50% of economically efficient greenhouse gas abatement. So clearly a really important sector for the climate policy issue. Land-based activities, agriculture in particular, is very sensitive to climate change. So from a climate impacts point of view, this is also very important. These impacts vary tremendously across the globe, and that's where we need spatially explicit information, not just on climate, but on soils and productivity of agriculture and so on. So it's very important both from the mitigation and the impacts point of view and the climate side. And in terms of poverty reduction, agriculture is also critically important simply because the majority of the world's absolute poor, those living on less than $1 a day, still live in rural areas, are predominantly dependent on agriculture for their earnings. So we think agriculture is at the heart of this issue, and to tackle these questions, we need spatial data covering the globe, not just for the U.S., not just for the rich countries, but many of these challenges, the biggest challenges are in developing countries where these data aren't available. If they are available, they aren't available over time. You need the data over time in order to do the statistical work, in order to calibrate the models, in order to understand how these processes are evolving. So just some questions that we'll be talking about here. Nelson will be highlighting a few of these as the talk goes forward. The challenge of boosting yields around the world to feed this additional population without expanding area dramatically. How much potential is there? We don't know. We don't fully understand that yet. How should we spend the money being appropriated for reduced deforestation, reduced emissions from deforestation that's currently being appropriated? We want to target that to the areas where it'll have the highest payoff. That's the kind of question that you need these data to answer. To answer that question. The impact of water scarcity on agricultural output and trade, the impact of climate change, and the impact of increasing climate extremes, all very important questions requiring this kind of geospatial data. So I'd like to turn it over to Nelson now to walk you through in person some more of the nuts and bolts of these problems and our proposal. Nelson, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. So I want to visit some of the to illustrate the usefulness of this data in answering these questions, I want to revisit some of the lessons that we got from the literature review that we. Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah? Okay, so it's okay? Okay. So, for example, when we talk about food security, an important thing to know is where we have productive problems. So here we have the so-called yield gaps. Yield gaps are the difference between actual yield and what could be attained, the potential yield. So we have very high, in the green areas, this is where the yield gaps are close to zero. That is, potential yields and actual yields are very close. And then we have areas of the world that still could improve productivity quite a bit. So this kind of spatial detail is essential to for example, define where investments are needed for increasing yields. If you see, this is data for year 2000. Even though we are in 2012, this is the state of the art now. And part of this is because these are one-time efforts. The money comes, the product is delivered, and then it's not updated. So this is one of the concerns we have in GeoShare and what we would like to help to solve. The spatial data allows us to locate things on the map. That's important. But it also allows to understand what's driving, in the case of the yield gaps, those deficiencies in productivity. So this is a study where they got the yield gaps and say, well, what are the forces that are driving there? Are irrigation, market influence, market access? And what we have here is that, for example, in West Africa, it's an issue of accessibility. In Central America, it's irrigation. So it allows us not just to say, well, where is production lower, but it also allows us to say, well, what kind of remedies should we apply for solving these productivity problems? Tom mentioned the need for time series, and this is a very important aspect. As I just mentioned, most of the data sets that are out there are one-time efforts, and there is not a sustainability initiative over time. This is data that is used by Conservation International, Bosch and collaborators, to help Indonesia to design their payments schemes for implementing the reduction through the reduction of emissions, of greenhouse gas emissions, through reductions in deforestation and land degradation. And the hypothesis here is that deforestation is driven by land returns. So the government of Indonesia has to figure out how to put incentive in place to motivate farmers not to deforest anymore. So what Bush and his collaborators did, they assembled time series of data. It's a non-optimal environment in terms of data, and they did some econometric modeling of this. Now, the same needs for understanding this are in Bolivia, in Peru, and in all the countries that want to benefit from this RED Plus scheme. So imagine that we could have a platform. So if Bush et al., they are doing this for several countries, each country they go, they have to undertake these massive data gatherings. The data is not always good quality. So what we would like to provide is a data set where they could go with their model, change their inputs, and advise this government. This will create a huge economies of scale in terms of data and analytics, in this case for an environmental problem. Another example, also very interesting, and this highlights that even though we have advanced quite a bit in terms of satellite pictures, there are still huge discrepancies in our understanding of land cover. So this is provided by Stanley Wood. Stanley Wood is one of our partners in GeoShare. He works for IFPRI, for the International Food Policy Research Institute in Sub-Saharan Africa, and he gave us 4 maps, 4 satellite pictures for Tanzania, and you can see Modis, for example, says that this is only forest, and you can see that other satellites are telling a different story about this. So one of the needs that this community working on global modeling of the sustainability of the agricultural system is to have some standard classifications about land cover. And this is also something that we expect GeoShare to contribute to. So these are all part of the things we review when we wanted to examine how are we in terms of data. And basically this is the diagnosis we have for this study that was funded by the Foresight Program of the United Kingdom. Basically, we have the state of the art of data, of spatially explicit data, it's very poor. We don't have enough data to understand what's going on and what we need to do into the future. And there are data sets out there. Many of them are regional or national. Few are global. One of the things that we understood in this exercise is that with global phenomena, you need global data to understand the linkages with the local data sets. When they are global, they are mutually incompatible. They are not interoperable. They weren't created for doing so. So to merge a data set on irrigation and land productivity, it's very difficult just because they were created by different people, different groups using different standards. And many of them are not publicly available. It's very hard to have access to them. When they are publicly available, there are huge barriers to use this data. One of them is software. The software is highly specialized, costly licenses, and of course you need expertise. So we found a consensus on the idea that the lack of information is greatly inhibiting our ability to understand policy issues related to the poverty, environment, agricultural nexus. What's the solution we propose to this? Well, it's this idea of GeoShare. We are thinking, or we are proposing, a nodal structure that is scalable. We have these are the founding nodes, if you want, coordinated by Tom and myself from here, from Purdue. And the way this has shaped over time is we have 3 global nodes and 3 regional nodes. The 3 global nodes are going to provide irrigation data, global irrigation. Stefan Sieber in the University of Bonn in Germany. Naveen Ramakuti from McGill University in Canada, he creates data on productivity, land use, etc. Noah Diffenbaugh at Stanford, he'll put data on climate model simulations and historical data on climate. So these global nodes are going to be, the data is going to be verified, enriched, and informed by people working at the local level. Andy Nelson, it's in the Philippines. He works for IRRI, one of the CGR centers, the International Rice Research Institute. So he will be providing data on agricultural, environment, and poverty for Asia. Stanley Wood, who I mentioned already, he's working Sub-Saharan Africa, so he will be putting the same data. So we can picture a global grid, where people will be attaching their data just to get better information. It's a fact that these global data sets, they are much better. They depend on the quality of the underlying data, so that they tend to be much more precise in the US and Europe than in Africa, for example. So the idea with Stanley would be to improve that information. And the same in Latin America. Glenn Hyman is with the Center for International Tropical Agriculture in Cali, Colombia. So GeoShare has shaped in a way that is combining global and regional nodes. And we can add more nodes as we grow. I'll talk more about that. And a key part of this is the HubZero architecture. We want to, Rudolf Eigenmann, professor of electrical and computing engineer here at Purdue, leads the NEAS, the earthquake network, and they centralize data for 14 sites. We want to learn from them to use the HubZero here. The HubZero is a technology that really can capture your imagination when you start seeing that it allows to exchange simulation tools, computer scripts. So it's a great tool for building capacity. And it's a strong component that will be here at Purdue. So let me recap a bit. The objective of GeoShare, first and foremost, is to provide a globally consistent, temporally opportune, so that the idea of creating wave of data over time is very important, and locally relevant data sets for better decision making. To assist decision makers, policy analysts, and researchers. So one of the things that we have learned over these 2 years is, or over the last year, is that the data has to respond to the needs of policy makers, and here is where the regional centers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America really have a role to play to connect the needs of donors, governments, and so forth in terms of data. And then the issue of building capacity. The idea is to train individuals that can understand this data, the usefulness, and bridge the gaps across institutions and across disciplines to help decision making. This is a roadmap where we want to go. As I said, that the nodes are scalable, so over time we see more nodes coming into GeoShare, and the idea is to have a complete picture of the resources and management practices that are combined with economic and institutional factors conveying the agricultural sector to produce food, fiber, fuel, etc., and that have environmental externalities. So this is a bit a summary of the conceptual framework of GeoShare in terms of the data contents. And just to end my presentation, we would like to give a progress report of what happened as a direct consequence of this GPRI seed grant for the workshop. The workshop was hosted by the Purdue Climate Change Research Center. And we had 3 objectives. This workshop was in May last year. Exchange information among leading researchers. Those are the researchers that you saw in the pictures a few slides ago about, well, data availability, which data is ready to launch the project, research and policy questions, refine the technical and operational details of GeoShare, introduce the project to potential sponsors, discuss institutional design, and long-run sustainability issues. This was very key in that workshop. As an outcome, well, our team here at Purdue grew quite a bit. At the beginning was just Tom and I. Now we have linked to the people working with the HubZero. We got money for a pilot project, for a proof of concept. I'll talk about that in the next slide. And we also responded. We have a concept note for a USA higher education request for application. This is we requested $25 million. This is one of those projects, low probability, high payoff, that will allow GeoShare to take off. And we are in the process of networking. Tom, in particular, was 2 weeks ago in the Planet Under Pressure conference in London, and it's presenting this at the OECD meeting of the Joint Working Group on Agricultural and Environment. There is a meeting in Paris next week. Tom may say more about that later. So just to finalize my presentation, the pilot project, we got $600,000. Most of it is coming from the Department for International Development of the United Kingdom. DIFRA from the UK also is putting some money, and we got funds from USDA, from the Economic Research Service. This is enough for a proof of concept. The idea at this point is to see if the whole concept is going to work out. We will have a case study in Asia, one in Africa, and the idea is to combine regional and global databases to see how it works, and also have a HubZero infrastructure delivering contents and analytical tools ready. And our idea is in 2014 have a donors forum, a larger meeting, where we can demonstrate the success of the proof of concept and secure long-term funding for GeoShare. So, thank you. Pleasure.
Well, we have time for one or two questions, but we'll segue into our question and answer session, and we'll run that until about 11:30, 11:35. Yes, please, Jim.
I'm just curious, this may be beyond the scope of what you're doing here. This seems to be predominantly supply side related. But I'm curious how you're thinking about, if at all, competing uses for land, particularly in crops, particularly around energy production, whether it's biofuels, solar farm development, or wind development. With the notion being that when you talk 2050, a lot of people want to see a substantial fraction of our energy supply come from renewable supplies, which will also compete for, I think, some of the same land. Is that something you're considering, or is that beyond? So.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't put my
You're coming through well, Tom.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we're very interested in the biofuels issue in particular because that has been a source of concern. The food fuel competition, GeoShare, as it's envisioned presently, is well set up to wrestle with the question of first, maybe even certain types of second generation biofuels. When you look around the world, it's amazing how many countries do have mandates. It's not just the US and Europe, China, India. Many countries in Latin America have visions of significant amounts of energy coming from biofuels in the future. And so that is an important part of this whole thing. And to the extent we've covered completely crop production and potential crop production, that's a good start. We have not, in this first phase, we don't, actually one of the useful things about the workshop, we had in the workshop last year, we had people presenting on forestry and some of the other competing uses for land, and we realized we didn't have the funds to be that ambitious. So we scaled it back to focus primarily on agriculture initially and largely on crops. And we envision this, though, expanding in the future. And I think in particular, the biofuels is quite relevant. I mean, having the geospatial data will be useful for, placing solar, for example, solar energy in the context of this land competition. But I think the main emphasis will be on biofuels.
By the way, I think it's a spectacular initiative to try to bring a common data set to help inform global policy decisions, because so many people argue around their own data as opposed to a common set of data and argue on principles. So I applaud the initiative for sure.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Let's see if there are any other questions, and then I'll come back to you, Abdul Fattah.
I also applaud this initiative, but I have a question.
Press the microphone.
My question is, with our U.S. geospatial agency and many of the defense initiatives that are involved in these discussions, is there no way that they can assist with projects like this with providing data to you, or have you explored the possibility of small grants with international impact through any of the security agencies?
So far, our discussions have been obviously with USDA. USDA has provided seed funding for this. I've had conversations with NASA, and we're in touch with them. They have quite an ambitious agenda, mostly focused on satellite imagery, obviously. GeoShare is all about making that link between what you can see from satellites and what you can't see from satellites. Things like poverty, things like productivity, those are things where we need on-the-ground data, administrative data, census data to supplement this. So there's a certain amount of data fusion that has to happen. But NASA's, interested. We're in communication. We haven't communicated with any of the security agencies, although I assume that they work closely with NASA. So that's where we are right now. There are many, many possibilities for connecting. We'd be very interested if you could provide us with links. Send an email to Nelson and myself, copied to anyone who you think is relevant, making the introduction. We'd be glad to follow up. Thanks, but thanks for the suggestion.
Father?
This is a very exciting project, but I would like to see, or at least to know, whether you factor marginal lands, forages, agricultural byproducts, and animal use. Because food security broadly is more than the crops, as you know.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. Actually, I'm having a Skype conversation tomorrow morning, also at an early time for me here in California, with someone, Mario Herrero at the International Livestock Research Institute in Nairobi, and Naveen Ramankutty, who's introduced us, and we'll be talking about scope for bringing livestock into this. We're very interested, and that would be a next step. So we're already looking to the livestock side of things. In terms of the marginal lands, I mean, that is part of GeoShare is global land cover data. So that's, fairly widely available, not fully reconciled. So we will start with global land cover, including marginal lands, before we zoom into croplands and potentially pasture lands and so on for more detailed information about productivity and so on. But yeah, good point. We need to think, even as we're trying to do this ambitious task, we need to think more broadly as well.
I can say something quick, please. Would you factor agricultural byproducts as part of your productivity equation?
Byproducts, I assume are you thinking about byproducts of processing, for example, DDGS from ethanol production? What are you thinking about in terms of byproducts? Are you thinking about corn stover?
When you harvest the crop, whatever left, the stalk and other things, failed crops, other things that you cannot use for human consumption.
Right. Well, that's the corn stover, for example, very important potentially for biofuel production. So that's a good point. I'm going to have to look closely at how the product classifications are broken up. Currently, we're working with 175 FAO product classifications, and to the extent. Yeah, I'm not sure how well the byproducts are dealt with. That's a good question. We need to look into that.
This question is for Professor Villoria. I was wondering, in your graph of the geospatial data, where you had attainable yields, or shall I say potential for attainable yields?
I can't hear. I don't know whether is that question directed to us.
Yes, sir.
Depress your speaker.
I'm doing that. Okay, can you hear me better?
Can you hear me?
Apparently need to leave your finger on that button.
That's what I'm doing. Can you hear me better?
Yeah, if you just speak up, I think I'll be able to hear you.
Okay, thanks. So the question is, I think it's the next slide, where market access was one of the causes why yields were not attainable in sub-Saharan Africa, I believe, that region. And I was wondering if you could expand on that, on the market access.
Nelson, do you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. Let me just put the slide back.
Is the second slide next to this one? So just advance it one.
I lost. Okay. Sure. So, well, two things. That's a very that's a very poor measure of market influence, and this is part of what we need better data. This is GDP at the grid cell level, downscale under a lot of assumptions. And basically, I don't think they are not trying to explain causality here. It's more simple correlation between places that have low access or where markets are underdeveloped, in this case by the measure of GDP, tend to have lower productivity or higher yield gaps. That's what's behind this, the science behind this map. I don't know if you want to add, Tom. I think you want.
Can I add something on that? Yeah, I think this is an excellent example of what GeoShare is about. We read this paper. It was published in Agricultural Systems in 2010, and immediately said we don't like this accessibility measure, the market influence measure. Being economists, the people writing this paper were largely not economists. We had some other ideas about how to measure those. And of course, since then, there have been some great advances in accessibility measures, spatially explicit accessibility measures. And but we wrote to the people, asked for the data, didn't get the data, and looked at what it would take to reproduce their data. And it takes 6 months of a grad student working on this. And the returns were uncertain, so we didn't have a chance to pursue it. With GeoShare in place, as envisioned, this would be a relatively easy exercise to say, okay, well, I want to use some different economic variables here, sharpen the definition of market access, and see whether that result is still robust, see whether we can understand it better. So this is an excellent example of where GeoShare could greatly enhance the science. And currently, there's a great barrier to doing this important research because of that lack of accessibility.